Okay, welcome back to part two of chapter 30, Plant Diversity, part two. Um, as we ended in part one, we talked about your gymnosperms and what is different about them and all the diversity it has according with the four phyla that is made up of gymnosperm. So now we're ready to move on to angiosperm. Angiosperms are known as flowering plants because they will produce flowers, and the seed is kind of residing within the flower when a fruit is produced. So these are seed plants with reproductive structures called flowers and fruits. Flowers will eventually become the fruits with the seed inside that can then be dispersed elsewhere for repopulating another area, regrow into another area. So, angiosperm actually make up the most diverse and widespread of all plants. It makes up 90% of all plants available. So, angiosperm are classified in a single phylum, which are called Anthophyta. In a sense, you're like, well, that simplifies it, but within that one phylum, we have more than 290,000 species that fall under the category of angiosperm. So you can see how genetically diverse or how much genetic variation we have with angiosperm and why they inhabit most of our plants, okay, or make up most of our plants. So let's explain what are the different structures in angiosperms first before we get to their life cycle and also their diversity. So first of all, they have flower, as we talked about. That's what's different for with angiosperms compared with all plants. Flower is for sexual reproduction in these angiosperms, and it is for insects and animals to transfer pollen from one flower to the next. Um, that's why flowers are necessary, and a lot of time flowers are beautiful with bright colors because it is to attract those insects to that area, get its nectar. Sometimes flowers have what's called nectar in it, and insects feed on those nectars. And when they go inside to get the nectar, a lot of time pollen grains would end up being stuck on the insect's body, and that's how they're able to transfer pollen from one flower to the next flower's ovule. Okay, so the pollen, remember, is the sperm cells of one plant, and then those sperm cells can go on to germinate and sort of fertilize ovules of another plant. But not all the time wind can do it for you. Wind can, some can happen. That's why some are wind pollinated. But usually, when we're talking about wind pollination with angiosperms, we're talking about grasses and shrubs that are really close to each other so that there's a high chance of wind blowing that pollen grain onto exactly that spot of where the ovule is. So, um, whereas if you're talking about having pollinators, insects or animals, they are actually more direct form of pollination where they will take those pollen and literally put it on another plant by flying around and, maybe eating the fruits or drinking and taking in that nectar. So flowers usually have four main floral organs. I know it's weird to think of them as organs, but it is an organism, which an organism is made up of organs. Just not so complex. Be thankful that is only four. Compared to humans, we have a lot more. So for flowers, there are what's called sepals, which is this one right here, pointing to these green leaves on the bottom of the leaves. We start from the most bottom to the most top. These are green leaves that actually enclose the flower before it opens. So you know how when you see flower, they're like a little bud before they start to form actual petals. You see this green bud, and that green bud is enclosed by these sepals. So when the flower is ready to open, the sepals will open as well. Second organ is called the petal, which are any of these you're seeing here. Those are all petals, which are then your brightly colored petals that will attract your pollinators. That's how, pollinators know to go to a flower, and they know that that is a source of food for them in terms of nectar. That's how they can tell the difference between all the greens in the trees or the grass, or the shrubs areas, because they can see this brightly beautiful flower, and that's how they go towards it. Um, Now, unless it is wind pollinated, for wind pollinated angiosperms, they actually don't have very bright color flowers. Usually they're kind of dull, or even kind of small, even because they don't need to rely on insects to help them pollinate. They don't need to attract any pollinators. Third organ is the stamen. Stamen is right here, which is which are micro sporophyll. That which it means is it's for the male part of the plant. They will produce microspores. And how you can easily remember this is micro means small, okay? And then you know how sperm and egg looks like. Sperm is like super tiny compared to the size of an egg. It's like thousandths the size of the 1,000th the size of an egg. So the fact that it says micro being small tells you, oh, that has to do with the sperm portion, which is then the male portion of the sexual reproductive organ, okay, of the flower, okay. And then spore tells you that this is males. So microspore tells you is male spores, which will eventually develop into a pollen grain. And where do those pollen grain reside in is actually your anther area. So up here you have these little budded, kind of like a little sac. Those are what's called your anther. And within that sac of anther is where you have production of those pollen grain. And then on the bottom of the anther, you have a filament right here, which is the stalk that connects your anther to the rest of your flower. All right, and then the fourth portion organ of the flower is carpel. Carpel is then the opposite of stamen. You can think of it that way. It is a mega sporophyll that produce mega spores, large spores, in this case, the egg that would develop into your female gametophytes. And there is actually a container where seeds are enclosed, just like this, in a container where seeds are enclosed. And the tip of that carpel, so this whole part is the carpel, okay? Oops. I turned that off. Okay. And then the top, the very tip of the carpel is called stigma. On the stigma is where you have this sticky substance that allow to pollen to be received from other things, from insects or from the wind. Or else, if it's not sticky, how do you expect that pollen to stay on the carpel and then going on to other places? So that's why you have that sticky substance to allow for that pollen. Even if the insect was just to fly by the flower, it has a chance of sticking to the stigma. So stigma is the where you will receive the pollen, either from wind or from pollinators, and then they will actually go into the style. The style is this long portion right here, kind of like the stem of the carpel, and it leads into what's called the ovary, just like humans. And then within the ovary is where you can have one or more ovules. And when any of these ovules are fertilized, they will then develop into a seed within the flower itself. And sometimes the wall of the ovary will thicken and grow into a big ripe fruit. So now a single carpel is also referred to as a pistil. So sometimes you will see people calling that entire part, a pistil instead of a carpel. Now, after fertilization occurs, ovules will then develop into seeds, while the ovaries wall will thicken. This is what I talked about earlier, and that is what causes the seed or the ovary to mature into a fruit. So the seed usually is not, some of them are good, some of them are not that great for ingesting. So how it attracts animals from eating it is by forming this fruit texture and fruits layer that is beneficial for the animals. So what we mean by fruit ovary versus seeds is, imagine a pea pod. Okay, if you look at a pea pod, the pea inside, if you open the pod itself, those peas are actually then the seeds. So this is the case where you do eat the seeds, but apple seeds, watermelon seeds, things that usually we don't ingest, that's the other seeds. And then you have pod, the pea pod's pod itself is then the ovary. In that case, in the pea pod's case, that ovary wall didn't thicken too much. Thicken a little bit to make that tough texture of the outside of the pea pod, but it's not thick like all these other fruits here that we'll talk about. So the fruit is what protects the seed and also aid in the work of dispersal, this dispersal of the seed itself. Okay, so how it protects the seed is by having this thick outer layer or hard outer layer, depending whether it's a dry seed or a dry fruits or a fleshy fruits. So mature fruits, like I was saying, can be fleshy, and fleshy fruits usually have an outer layer called the pericarp. And that pericarp is the wall of the fruit, and usually when they're small and just form, they're hard. But as that fruit ripens, it becomes softer for ingestion. So imagine tomatoes, plums, grapes, peaches. Okay, the grapefruits, those are all fruits where you have peach is harder, but it's still soft. But compared with tomato and peaches, we can actually eat the pericarp, has this soft when it's ripe, and then grapefruit we probably have to cut it open to eat the fruits within. But all of these have seeds inside. Tomatoes, we actually eat the seeds along with the tomato flesh, but for nectarine, we probably don't eat the seed. That seed is very hard and bulky, so that was something we don't eat, but we eat the fleshy part usually. But what do we do with the seed? We toss them out. Okay, so nowadays in the civilized world we have trash cans. But imagine back in the day when caveman age, where we're still living in the caves, and if they have to go hunting, they have to plant their own fruits or harvest their own fruits. After they eat the fruits, they will toss the seed somewhere, and that seed may end up somewhere maybe a couple miles away from where that tree was originally at. And that's how the fruit itself have aid in dispersal of the seeds, is because the fleshy part of the fruit is what attracted animals or humans to eat it and then spit out that seed elsewhere. In a sense, we ourselves or the animals can play the role of a pollinator, quote unquote. Okay. Now, fruits can also be dry, and these include your beans, nuts, and grains. So for these dry fruits, some of them will remain closed throughout the entire lifetime. Some will split open to actually release the seeds. So those that remain closed are usually really thin and they're directly stuck next to the seed, and that's why they don't need to open. But there are nuts like hazelnuts, peanuts, etc. Then those actually can split open to release the seed within. Now, cereal grains of maize, which is a type of corn, rice, wheat, and also other grasses are actually dry fruits, because we tend to think of rice or these small little grains as seeds because they're so small. But no one can grow rice if you throw rice into the soil. Okay, you need the actual plant itself, which is the grass looking part of rice, of the rice plants. So just keep in mind that these cereal grains are not seeds. Even though they look like it, they're actually fruits, dry fruits, and for that matter. All right, so different fruits have actually different dispersal method. I kind of talked about the animal part of it. Now, but with different shapes and sizes and structures, they actually have different ways of dispersal. For example, with dandelions and maples, they have seeds in fruits that actually function like parachutes or propellers that can easily be dispersed by wind. So we all know that if you have a parachute or propellers, they tend to stay in the air longer instead of just dropping straight to the ground. And that's what allows, even though if it's a bigger seed that is kind of heavier, because of their shape, like of their shaping like a parachute or propeller, they can kind of glide along the wind and go to longer distances before they land. And that's how that allows for, effective wind dispersal when we're talking about that in this case. All right. And then coconuts are actually fruits that can be dispersed by water. So that's why when we dump, throw coconuts into water or river or something, they will float because of the fact that they are for use that purpose to disperse it elsewhere. Some fruits actually shaped like burrs, kind of like this, where there's rough edges on it that can cling to the animal. Either if they have fur on the animal, they will cling to the fur. Or if we as humans walking, hiking in the wild, in the mountains, sometimes we catch all these seed fruits on our pants and on our shoes, socks, etc. Because these birds get cling to it. And then, of course, we don't usually know that there's all these fruits, burrs stuck to our shoes or socks until maybe we walked a good amount of distance and then we pluck it off and throw it off onto another area of dirt or soil, or we will sort of then that in that sense, we have again played a role of pollinator dispersing those fruits and seeds into another area just because they got stuck on ourselves. And lastly, some fruits, like I said, are edible. Usually they are bright color to attract the animals to eat them. They are nutritious and they're also sweet flavored. No animal would like to eat a bitter flavor fruit. So, humans won't even do that. Why would animals do? So they like, sweet flavors. So fruits tend to have those special characteristics and traits just to attract these animals and humans to eat them. And then they can disperse the seeds elsewhere. So of course, if it's something you ingest, that means we're not sometimes we spit it out. Like if you were to eat seeded watermelons, people don't like to swallow them. They might spit out the watermelon seeds or apple seeds, etc. Sometimes nowadays we cut them out. But then seeds can actually end up in feces if we ingest the whole fruit itself that have seeds like tomatoes or seeds are very resilient, so a lot of times those seeds can end up unharmed within the digestive tract. And when again, we're talking about not civilized area, but we think back in the caveman age time period where you would poop in the wild. And when you defecate in the wild, usually that piece of feces will end up on a good piece of soil. And feces itself and the soil provide these natural fertilizers that allow for those seeds to germinate. And in this super good environment, they can actually then germinate into seedlings and grow a new plant from there. And depending on how far we have traveled before we defecate, sometimes this can carry seeds to very, very far distances, kilometers of distances. So here is then the angiosperm life cycle. Okay, we've got done talking about some special aspects about them. So the anthers, as we've said, is where sperm is produced. So we have those microsporangia that develop into pollen grain, which then will contain your male gametophytes. Now each gametophyte has actually two haploid cells for angiosperm. One type of haploid cell is called the generative cells, which will actually form two sperm, and we'll talk about why specifically two sperm in a bit. And then the other haploid cell will form what's called tube cell, which is for producing that pollen tube. We already talked about the gymnosperm's life cycle and said that when pollen grain lands on the ovule, it still needs to make this pollen tube, and it is the pollen tube that penetrate into the megaspore that allows for sperm to go directly into it. So tube cell are the ones that are making that pollen tube for delivery of sperm. All right, so ovules are developed within the ovary, like we've talked about, and they contain female gametophytes called embryo sac. And within the embryo sac is where it consists of a few cells, which one of them will be an egg. Now, pollinators or wind will carry those pollen to the sticky stigma, like I was talking about at the tip of the carpel. That's why usually when you look at carpel of a flower, they kind of stick out. Same as anthers, they also stick out so that, pollinators can gather those pollens and go to somewhere else. Now, usually when we're talking about pollination, we hope to have cross pollination. Cross-pollination means that we're transferring pollen from the anther of one flower plant to the stigma of another flower on another plant. Okay, so we're not talking about one, let's say one tree with flowers on it, and they're just pollinating all the flowers within that one tree. Hopefully, there's another tree nearby where they have a different group of flowers, and then they can cross-pollinate, meaning mix up that gene a little bit. Just like how we can have selective mating. That's how we mix up the gene a little bit, or we have those shuffling mechanisms to mix up the genes a little bit. In this case, cross-pollination is what it allows for mixing up of the genes that would enhance genetic variability. That genetic variation we talked about that has been very important for our biodiversity. So pollination is usually preferred over self-pollination. And if a plant was to self-pollinate, it actually will do things to prevent self-pollination from happening. Like they might produce egg or produce sperm at different time periods so that they don't end up pollinating themselves. Because if they make sperm and egg at the same time, then of course they will pollinate themselves. But if they make these two different sex cells at different time periods, then for sure they will have to rely on another plant for the other sex cell. All right, pollen grain will then germinate where the tube cell will produce your pollen tube and then grows down within the style. Okay, so this is, remember, there's the flower and there's that carpel. So the top of that is the stigma, and then the length of the carpel is called the style. Okay, and it is this pollen tube that will penetrate through what's called the micropyle. Just remember, micro again sounds like small. Pile starts with a P, so that's for maybe a pore of some sort. So this is equivalent to a pore within the ovule integument, because we said what at the bottom here, what surrounds the ovule is the ovary, and within the ovule you have these integument layer that surrounds and protects the megaspore within. So what helps to penetrate that megaspore or that integument is by having this pollen tube that can penetrate through. And within there, they will discharge two sperm into the embryo sac once the pollen tube has reached the megaspore. So why is there specifically two sperm? Well, one sperm will fertilize the egg to form your diploid zygotes, which will eventually become your embryo. The other sperm actually fuses with two nuclei within the central cell, and they will produce what's called the triploid cell. And that is for another purpose. We'll explain a little bit in the next point. But this is what we call the process of double fertilization. Double fertilization, meaning that you have two sperm fertilizing two different things at the same time. Why do we need that? Well, ovules will mature into seed as we know it, and that zygote comes from that first sperm that has fertilized the egg, and then that zygote will develop into your sporophyte embryo, which will then grow sort of rudimentary roots, some early roots, and also what's called cotyledons. Cotyledons are, what we call seedling leaves, very tiny little leaves that are starting to bud off from the sporophyte itself. So those are called cotyledon, which stands for seed leaves. Now, what happens then with the other sperm that have fertilized or combine with the central cell to form your triploid cell? Well, that triploid cell is then for the purpose of developing into an endosperm. Endosperm is then what provides the starch. Okay, it has lots of starch in it, which means it has a lot of carbohydrate sugars for the cell or the embryo to have energy, and they have a lot of other food reserves for the embryo. So it's kind of like our yolk sac, okay? When we talk about humans, reproductive system, when an egg is fertilized by a sperm, it also becomes a zygote, and then an embryo also with a yolk sac. Because before the first trimester is over, their umbilical cord and placenta is not formed fully yet. So what gives the baby food during that first 12 weeks is really that yolk sac. So in this case, it's a similar thing. That sporophyte is not a mature plant yet. There's no way it can do a lot of photosynthesis and provide for itself yet. So that's why there's endosperm. And in the endosperm's case, this is what provides the food to nourish that embryo for it to grow and develop. So, they say one might ask, why do you need this double fertilization? Why can't you, fertilize the central cell first to have those triploid cell ready to roll before the fertilization of the egg? Well, they say that double fertilization is what synchronizes the development of food storage with the development of embryo, which is important because if there's no fertilization, no embryo, you don't need food, you don't need to spend the energy to make all this food storage because that takes energy too. So if there's no fertilization and no embryo, all that food that's been made is just a waste. So that's why they say you want the formation of embryo, development of embryo to go in sync with time with the for development of food storage. Okay, kind of like how again going back to humans, we have uterine cycle and ovarian cycle that would have to sync with each other so that when the egg is ovulated, your uterine wall is getting ready to um, receive that potential embryo coming through if it was fertilized. So it's kind of like similar where two things have to happen at the same time for preparing the nurturing of the growing embryo. All right, so here is the angiosperm life cycle, kind of similar to the gymnosperm. It's just that now you have this double fertilization going on. So in the first step, right here, you have the sporangium of the flower, and within the megasporangium, you have multiple ovule. Each ovule will have a megasporocyte that divides by meiosis into four megaspores, and usually only one survives. And I already kind of talked about why you need to make four, but usually only one of those survive will then become your female gametophytes by mitosis. Okay, step two, you have your microsporangium or microsporangia, depending if you're singular or plural, which is within your anther of the stamen within the flower. This whole part right here, this is why zooming into the red portion, that is where your microsporangium is. And then within there, you have microsporocytes that divides by meiosis to make four microspores. So this is where you have your male microsporocytes that will turn into your male gametophyte within the pollen grain to make your pollen grain. All right, so the microspore, like we said, will turn into pollen grain, and then it will kind of split into your generative cell and tube cell. Generative cell will divide into two sperm, while your tube cell will produce the pollen tube that's going to be very important for delivering the sperm into the egg itself. Okay, so pollen tube, just like your pollen tube, just like your other, just like your gymnosperm cycle, they will elongate until it reaches through the style and discharge two sperm when it arrived at the ovule. Okay, so this is the style. Okay, there's that pollen tube growing when the pollen grain touches the top of the carpel. Excuse me, I cannot turn off my notification on my iPad because um, I have YouTube videos embedded within my slides, so I need to have internet connection. If I turn off internet connection on my iPad, then I cannot access, play the YouTube video. So excuse me for my notifications keep popping up. I will try to dismiss them as they come up. But So pollen tubes will elongate through the entire length of the style and reach the ovules, ovaries, and then the individual ovules, and then they will discharge two sperm, okay, into for that double fertilization process. So one sperm will actually fertilize the egg, which will form your zygote, diploid zygote, and the other sperm will fertilize your central cells to make your endosperm. Okay, so here's the endosperm from that triploid cell that happened when you fuse the sperm with the other two haploid cells. And then you have the zygote now that develops into an embryo packaged with their food. That's what endosperm is for, and also covered up nicely with the seed coat so that it is very nice and protected and also nourished within the seed. So this seed will then, if it get tossed off to an area where it's likely to germinate, and it will pop up a seedling and rudimentary roots. That seedling will have leaves called cytoledon, okay, cotyledon, and then they will eventually become a new plant that will make new flowers and repeat the whole process all over again. So that seed will germinate into, uh-oh, something's gonna go bad. Let me discard and restart really quick. Um, yeah, that looked like errors. So seed will germinate, and then the embryo will develop into a mature sporophyte that will repeat the whole cycle all over again. Here is that video that kind of animates everything, this whole life cycle we talked about, so you can see it more visually.
Flowering plants undergo a unique reproductive process where there are two fertilization events. This double fertilization event occurs between the male reproductive organ, the male gametophyte, and the female reproductive organ, the female gametophyte. Before the fertilization event can occur, the ovule has to undergo some changes. At present, the ovule contains one reproductive cell, known as the megaspore or mother cell. This cell is diploid and undergoes meiosis, producing 4 haploid megaspores. In the majority of species, 3 of these megaspores degenerate, leaving only one surviving megaspore. This surviving megaspore expands and undergoes 3 rounds of mitosis to produce 8 haploid nuclei. As the nuclei have not developed any individual division, they initially share the same cytoplasm. This complete structure is known as the embryo sac. Within the established embryo sac, cell walls begin to form between most of the nuclei. 3 cells named antipodal cells form opposite the opening of the ovule, known as the micropyle. Another 3 cells form above the micropyle. 2 of these are synergids, and the other is the egg cell. This leaves 2 nuclei in the center of the ovule.
Micropyle is the
These
pore,
central
remember?
nuclei remain together in one large cell. It is the egg cell and this central nucleate cell which will eventually become part of the double fertilization event. In order for the double fertilization event to occur, the male gamete, the sperm, must travel from the anther to the embryo
There's the
sac
anther.
within the female reproductive organ. The pollen grain contains 2 main cells. A cell named the tube cell makes up the bulk of the pollen grain, and the sperm cell, which at this stage is known as the generative cell. To reach the embryo sac, a pollen grain must land on the stigma.
Showing self-pollination here, but we said most likely we'd rather have cross-pollination.
Once landed, it begins to germinate. The tube cell forms a long structure
There you
down the
go.
style and into the ovary. The generative cell travels behind the tube cell nucleus.
Paving a way for it to go into the egg cell.
Once near the ovary, it divides by mitosis to produce 2 haploid sperm cells. The pollen tube reaches the micropyle and releases the sperm cells into the embryo sac. One of the two sperm cells fertilizes the egg cell. This produces a diploid zygote, which will become the embryo. The other sperm cell moves
There's
up
the
and
embryo right
fuses with
there.
both of the central
Oops.
nuclei,
Oh, uh-oh. I shouldn't have done that. Let me get back to this part.
forming a
So there's
triploid
that
cell.
triploid cell.
This unusual triploid cell develops into an endosperm and serves as the embryo's food supply during early development. It is only angiosperms, flowering plants, which have this double fertilization characteristic, where a diploid zygote and a triploid endosperm form. Gymnosperms, pines, tracheophytes, ferns, and non-tracheophytes, mosses, lack this double fertilization feature.
Okay, so this is only something special for angiosperm when we're talking about double fertilization. All right, so let's talk about angiosperm diversity, just as we have talked about the gymnosperm diversity. So flowering plants are usually divided into just two groups, even though they only have one phyla. But we still further divide them into two groups because of the size of the amount of species they have. These two groups are based on the number of cotyledons they have on their embryo. So when they have embryos that only have one cotyledon, we call them monocots. So how you can remember that is mono means one, and then cot is where we have that cot from cotyledon. So this why this means one cotyledon. Dicots, which then were later, renamed into eudicots, means that these are plants with embryos that have two cotyledons. Di means two, and then cot for cotyledon, two cotyledon plants. Other than, whether you have one or two cotyledon, there are multiple differences between monocots plants and eudicot plants. So in regards to their cotyledon, we already said they have one versus two. For leaf venation or veins, vasculature, veins, usually for monocots, they are parallel, whereas for eudicot, they are kind of net-like. They form this vein-like network branching structure. In the stems, vascular tissues are usually scattered for dicots. For eudicot, they're usually arranged in a ring structure. For roots, monocots usually have very fibrous root system. There's no really main root, but a lot of kind of like a network of web of roots, whereas eudicot have a main root that is usually present, and then they diverge into your little tiny roots. I think that's called tap roots. And then for pollen, monocot usually have pollen grain that have one opening, while eudicot have pollen grain with three openings. For flowers, monocot usually have floral organs in multiples of three, while your eudicots usually have floral organs in multiples of four or five. So here are the different types of angiosperm. You have basal angiosperm, which is we call it the basal, kind of like our basal taxon, and that's because of the fact that these are the three species that have diverged first. Okay, three lineages of angiosperm that diverge first before other angiosperms. So they diverge very early on, kind of like that phylogenetic tree where we saw that first diverge of that one species, and then this one splits into two other one, etc. So we said this one happens first and also only by itself. So we call that a basal taxon. So that's why we call these your basal angiosperm, because they're, the one that diverge for early on in the history or fossil records of angiosperm. So these three lineages falls with Amborella trichopoda, which only has one single species in this lineage. They look like this right here. Water lilies are those that actually inhabit aquatic habitats. And then star anise kind of look like that, and they are actually the third lineage of this particular genus. Second type of, and our fourth lineage of angiosperm is magnolids. Magnolids actually is a large species where there's 8,500 species. So it's a big group of species we're talking about here that include your magnolia, laurels, and black pepper plants. And we usually see magnolia trees in our neighborhood or in your neighbor's backyard, and they form these beautiful big flowers that can be as big as 1 foot across in size. This particular species of magnolia is called Magnolia grandiflora and is also known as Goliath for the size of its flowers. The flower organs also tends to be in a spiral arrangement pattern for magnolias or magnolids. Third group of angiosperm, we have monocots, which makes up 25% of all angiosperm. Its largest group, and we're not going to mention all of them, but the largest groups are orchids, grasses, which includes your maize, rice, and wheat, and then your palms. So this is how orchid look like. Here's an example of palm, and then you have an example of grass, which in this case is barley grass. Last group is your eudicots, which makes up 2/3 of your angiosperm, which is a big group. It has large group in the legume family, which crops such as peas and beans are part of that legume family. There's also members in the rose family within the eudicot group. So this is where we have ornamental flowers, strawberry, apple, pears, etc. And then you have the group where you have flower trees mainly making up your oak, walnut, maple, willow, and birch. So this is one example of that snow pea plant, which is a legume. And then you have a dog rose plant, which is a wild rose. And lastly, you have this oak leaf from the oak tree, specifically Armenian oak tree. Now, why do we need all this, plants and angiosperm diversity and, overall plant diversity? Well, human welfare depends hugely on seed plants. Six crops alone, just six of these seed crops alone, your maize, corn, which is corn, rice, wheat, potatoes, cassava, and sweet potatoes yield 80% of all human consumed calories. That's a lot. Just six plants alone is able to feed 80% of our daily diet and is also used as livestock feed. So not only are we using it to feed ourselves, we are also using it to feed our livestock, such as cows. And that way, they can also, then that's how we get milk and also beef. So other food sources are also dependent on these crops based on our livestock industry. So we have to say because of how much it is needed around the world, the size and number of crops are now larger by artificial selection. We have artificially selected the larger plants. If it's a corn, we now have larger cobs around it, and also it now corns don't have that tough layer that surrounds it, so it's easier to harvest. And then there's also grains that are larger in size or more numerous in the amount of grains you can harvest per plant. That way we can have a lot of sources or resources for the world and to feed the world in a sense. Second thing is that it is plants that gives us coffee beans, cocoa, which is part of what makes chocolate, spices, tons of spices that come from flowers or cloves and saffron. Vanilla, black pepper, and mustard are all from the seed part of the plant. And then basil, mint, and sage are spices that are from the leaf part of the plant. And even the bark part of the plant can be a spice, such as cinnamon, which is why we take a bark and scratch off some cinnamon when we want some, raw cinnamon spice. All of these come from flowering plants. Third, seed plants specifically give us food, wood. Okay, and why it gives us wood is that seed plants have these very tough wall xylem that allows for trees to grow very, very tall. And I've talked about that in the last chapter. And it is these tall trees that serve as our primary source of fuel, wood pulp for paper, and also used as construction material, which I already said it is made to, used to make houses. A lot of the houses in America is made out of wood. In other countries such as Asia, however, we use cement and metal rods and kind of like big poles to stick it into the ground. But that's a different story. Okay, but America uses a lot of wood as the base of their houses. And then last but not least, plants are also used for medicines, where parts of the medicines are actually derived from seed plants. And they say about 25% of prescription drugs nowadays contain an active ingredient from seed plants. And here are just a few of them. There's a lot longer list because 25% of them are there, but here's just a short list of them if you are familiar with these. Atropine are from the belladonna plant. It is used as a eye pupil dilator. Digitalin is from foxglove, which is a heart type of heart medication. Menthol we all have seen and used in our, candies in the mouthwashes, and this is actually harvested from eucalyptus tree and is known to be a throat soother. Quinine, which is from cinchona tree, which is a malaria preventative. Taxol, a very famous cancer fighting drug. It is harvested from Pacific yew trees and is an ovarian cancer drug. Tobacurine is from curare tree, which is a muscle relaxant. And lastly, vinblastine is from this plant periwinkle and is also a cancer fighting drug specifically for leukemia. So you see how important plants are to all aspects of our lives, whether it be food source, whether it be spices and sweet source and drink source, whether it be building resources or even medicational resources. We need plants. If we lose the diversity, we lose all these resources. Unfortunately, plant diversity is not a renewable source. Yes, we can regrow plants and propagate plants to have more plants. The plant itself is a renewable resource, but remember, plant diversity is not. Once a plant species become extinct, it may never come back alive again. This is why we need to preserve our habitat for plant diversity. Unfortunately, many years ago, the exploding human population demanded a lot of space and a lot of resources that threaten plant diversity of species across the entire globe. They say that about 15 million acres of tropical rainforests are cleared each year for the purpose of using lumber. So scientists actually estimate that maybe they will be completely gone if we go at the same rate of clearing them, and they will be completely gone in the next 175 years. That is what they estimate if we were to keep cutting them down at the rate that we're going. Now, why is tropical rainforest so important in our ecosystem is that when we don't have these forests, we actually end up reducing the absorption of carbon dioxide. Remember, trees and plants are good for photosynthesis, and the photosynthesis not only make food for themselves, but also provide oxygen for our earth, which is why we have all this oxygen around for us to survive and breathe. So without these plants to absorb all these carbon dioxide that we're breathing out, this air can become toxic and also lead to global warming. So less photosynthesis can contribute to effects of global warming. And then this is actually a satellite image of where it shows the example of how much of our forests are we losing. And this specific image is actually from a very dense forest in Brazil. So in 1975, it was very dense. You can see all green, almost no bare areas. And this is an image taken in 2012. Okay, only 2012. We're already at 2024. Who knows how much worse it is by now if we haven't, been conserving it and rebuilding it. But all of these, sort of brown, like green area are trees that have been taken down. And when it's purple like this, it means it's completely urbanized and is bare. Okay, there's absolutely no tree in those area because there's a population of human population growing in that area. So why loss of trees is a bad thing, other than lessening the or decreasing the absorption of carbon dioxide? When you have less forest, it also means that you're losing species. You cannot get away from that. All of these dense forests around is what allows for new plant dive species to come about and also live on. When you take them all out, the species are going to be gone. And when trees are gone, you're really taking away the habitat of insects and animals. So you end up losing other diversity as well in the animal kingdom. Okay. And so scientists actually estimate that if current rate of loss continues, 50% or more of Earth species will actually become extinct within the next few centuries. And that's not too far away from now. We're talking about our next generation that will be facing this problem. So hopefully, and this is why we have many conservation programs now to make sure we can not just look at what we're, living in now, but also prepare for the future, our next generations to come. So tropical rainforests is also have been seen as a medical chest of healing plants because we have really only explored a very tiny fraction of all the plant species that are living in the forests today. Um, it's very difficult to study them, and maybe some species are not cannot be propagated in the lab setting, so they have to be harvested from the wild. So because we have studied so little of them, but yet we're destroying them, we can actually, plants can actually become extinct before we even get to study them. So again, emphasizing why it's important to conserve and preserve our plant diversity. Now, because I didn't show this video embedded in my other chapter, I thought it was best to show it now in the end of this plant diversity chapter. So I want to talk to you and convey the message. Why should we care about biodiversity?
The loss of biodiversity is a serious threat. But why is biodiversity important? And why should this one particular species be protected? Biodiversity is life, with all those different plants and animals, and that keeps each other beautifully in balance. But if you remove one block and another block, the tower becomes more and more unstable, and eventually it falls over. When an ecosystem collapses, nature no longer functions. Important functions are lost, such as water purification by the soil, CO2 storage by trees,
There you go.
temperature regulation by
Global
vegetation,
warming,
and the natural habitat for species
no
disappears.
homes for
A
animals.
collapsed system can have major consequences. More extreme weather conditions, such as erosion and flooding. In addition, it is very difficult to regain all biodiversity. Rebuilding a tower takes a long time and requires a lot of knowledge. That is why biodiversity is so important. That's why we have to be careful about it.
Okay. So that concludes chapter 30, Plant Diversity, Part 2. What we have left is just practice question and we'll be done. So why do two sperm nuclei travel down the pollen tube? What is that purpose for? Well, it's for double fertilization, which is where one sperm will fertilize the egg, the other combines with two polar nuclei. We didn't specifically say polar nuclei, but it happens in humans as well, where egg cells will make these polar bodies. But a similar case where then the other sperm fertilizes these two nuclei cells and will become your triploid cell. All right. For adaptation, cuticle, vascular tissue, seeds, and flowers are key characters defining of four major modern plant groups. Which group first evolved vascular tissue? Now, this goes back to chapter 29, probably. Ferns. Remember, ferns were the first seedless vascular tissue plant we talked about. Before that was actually non-vascular, which were the bryophytes. Flowering plants, which are angiosperms and gymnosperms, is just what we talked about now, but we talked about ferns before these. So, with the same question, which group will have first evolved seeds? Gymnosperms, because But again, bryophytes are the non-vascular plants with no seeds, of course. Ferns are the seedless vascular plants, again, no seeds. And then the next plant that come into play in the phylogeny of plants is the gymnosperm, followed by angiosperm. So angiosperm are the most recently evolved species of plants. The flowers of wind-pollinated plants do what? They are usually green and inconspicuous because I just talked about how flowers of pollinators that requires insect pollinators are usually very brightly colored to attract those pollinators. But whereas if we're just relying on the wind is not gonna distinguish between pretty flower and dull looking flowers. So that's why they are usually inconspicuous, and they don't need to be pretty because they don't need to attract those pollinators. They don't need to have those bright colors and beautiful colors because of that. It's just waiting for wind to brush them along and disperse them along. An ancient date palm seed germinated and grew into a healthy plant. What was the source of nutrients for the young sporophyte during germination? The whole point of having seeds. The food is stored within the seed itself. Why is seed dormancy adaptive for many plant species? Well, seed dormancy allows seeds to germinate and when conditions are favorable for seedling growth. So that way, when environment do change, like seasons, for example, the tree, the particular plant, if they can't handle very cold temperatures, it doesn't mean they have to become extinct and all die off. They can have these seeds, which then can germinate and become new and repopulate the land after the winter, let's say, for example. So dormancy allows for survival of plant species in a sense, in the natural way. Which product is or are derived from angiosperm? We just talked about this, all of the above, many, many categories. If you discover a new plant with fan-shaped leaves and seeds without fruits, you would have found a new kind of. Well, the main idea or main clue here is the fan-shaped leaves. The only one with that is the ginkgo phyta or ginkgos. Your lab partner asked you to hand over a flower part that will eventually enclose something with endosperm. So you gave her a what? Carpel. So that is what enclosed the endosperm. If you wanted to grow a garden filled with the earliest living flowering plants, you would need to plant which of the following? Earliest living plant, basal angiosperm earliest living flowering plants are the basal angiosperms. And that's all I have for you for chapter 30.